Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This is our new unit. We're going to be talking about ratios, rates, unit rates, and proportions. Okay. Our first video is going to be introducing to ratios, or an introduction to ratios, however you want to say it. That's what we're going to be doing. And our objective for this video is, as a student, you should be able to find the ratio from given scenarios. We're going to get started. I'm going to try to move kind of quickly. Ladies and gentlemen, you need graphic organizer number 1, and you're going to be working on side 1. But before you do that, please be aware that you're only using the top part. If you look underneath this little green box, there is part 2, or video number 2. You will do that one during video 2. I'm trying to save some paper. Ladies and gentlemen, do not come to me and say, Mr. Williams, you didn't do all this on the video. Yeah, there's a reason for that. Pay attention. All right, moving on. All right, we're going to get started. What is a ratio? That's the first thing on your graphic organizer. What is a ratio? Well, a ratio is very simple. It's a comparison of two quantities, or a comparison of two amounts. All right, so I might be comparing green to red. How many things are green? How many are red? That's a comparison of two amounts. Now, there's 3 ways we're going to write them, and this is the second part of your graphic organizer. In that second row, it says 3 ways to write a ratio. Way number 1 is to use a colon. Okay, and if you're going to use a colon, it's going to look like this one. I'm going to put a box around 6 to 8. The other way that you can do it, or the second way that you write one, is to use the word 2. So we're going to say 6 to 8. And finally, the last way is to write it like a fraction, which is 6 over 8. Go ahead and write all 3 of those in your graphic organizer. Make sure you have them. Write using a colon, using the word 2, and writing it like a fraction. Yeah, you need to know that. Moving on. Okay? Ratios. So we also, we just said they can be written in 3 ways. So here's the thing. A ratio is a comparison, right? Well, in this particular case, we're going to compare red to white. And these are squares just turned around. They look like diamonds, but they're squares. So we're going to compare red squares to white squares, all right? And we're going to write it in 3 different ways, and our 3 ways was 3 to 1, using the word 2, using a colon, 3 to 1, and finally as a fraction. So that's how we're going to answer those things, and you're going to use all 3 of them to answer your questions today. You're going to write everything using those 3 ways. All right, moving on. There's also 3 types of ratios. There is a part-to-part ratio, a part-to-whole ratio, and a whole-to-part ratio. That means a part-to-part comparison, a part-to-whole comparison, and a whole-to-part comparison. A good example of this is a part-to-part is, if we're looking at our classroom, boys to girls. All right, a part-to-whole example would be boys to our whole class, and whole-to-part would be our whole class to the number of girls. That's all it is. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to give you an example of each of those. The first one is a part-to-part. Okay, as you can see on the side, we have triangles. All right, we have 3 of them. Congratulations. But this is a part-to-part relationship that we're in a part-to-part comparison. So what we have is we're going to say part-to-part, and it is, we want to find the ratio of red to green. Well, part of those triangles are red, 1 of them to be exact, and part of them are green, 2 of them to be exact, and we write it in order. So we should have an answer of 1 to 2, or also 1 to 2, or 1 over 2 as a fraction. So that is a part-to-part relationship. I would write down this example by showing the triangles and maybe filling them in, maybe writing red on them and green on 2 of them. That's all I would do. You can also use colored pencils if you need, but honestly, you don't have time for that. Moving on. Second one. This time we're going to talk about a part-to-whole relationship. Now, if you look at this, okay, it says specifically part to whole, and we're going to say red to the whole amount. Well, what's the whole amount? Well, the whole amount of triangles, there's 3 of them. How many of them are red? Well, there's 1. So this is a 1 to 3, or 1 out of 3. Okay, we also need to write it 1 to 3 and 1 over 3. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a part to whole. Now let's do a whole to a part. So in this particular case, the whole is, oh wait, we have 3 triangles. That's the whole amount. We have 3 triangles. And how many of them are red? Well, 1 of them's red. So in this particular case, whole to red, we have whole is 3. 1 red one, it's 3 to 1, or 3 to 1, or 3 to 1. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a whole to part relationship. Now, those are all easy. Those are just examples. That's just basic information. What are we going to do with it? Well, here's the deal. I got a few examples for you, and then I'm going to show you some like you're going to see on your worksheet. Here's an example. So this is a ratio. It wants you to compare octagons to all shapes. So we need to look for the octagons first. And octagons are 8-sided, and octagons are red. It even says it in red. How many do we have? Well, we have 1. So we got it right there. We've got 1 of them. So this ratio is going to be 1 to all the shapes. Well, how many shapes do we have? Well, we have 8. There's 8 total shapes. If you look at all of them and counted them all, there's 8. So it's going to be a comparison of 1 to 8. So if we're going to do that, what we need to do is we actually need to write 1 to 8. We need to write it in all three ways, 1 to 8 or 1 over 8. Ladies and gentlemen, those are the three ways to write that. Moving on to the next example. This one, it says, compare all shapes to the trapezoid. Well, once again, this is a whole to a part because we're going to do all shapes. So we're going to do all of them, which is 8. We counted that first. And we need to do that to how many trapezoids? Well, there's only one trapezoid, so it's 8 to 1. And then 8 to 1, and finally 8 over 1. And I know that looks like an improper fraction, but you leave it. Okay, this is the one time with ratios you leave improper fractions. All right, moving on, next one. All right, and now we have ourselves our last one. This one says, compare pentagons to hexagons. So if we're going to do pentagons to hexagons, we first need to find out how many pentagons we have, which is here and here. So we have 2 of those, so our relationship is going to be 2. 2. And how many hexagons do we have? Well, those are in green. We have 1, 2, 3. So that's going to be 3. So we're going to go ahead and say 2 to 3. We need to write it in all three ways. 2 to 3. And finally, as a fraction, 2 over 3. There we go, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on. All right, here's what your worksheet's going to look like. You're going to do some that are very similar. I'm going to show you a couple examples on how I want these. I'm also going to show you something called simplifying ratios. Yeah, that stinks. Moving on. What is the ratio of triangles to stars? Or make sure that you do triangles first. So how many triangles do we have? Well, 3. How many stars do we have? 3. So it's a 3 to 3. It's also a 3 using a colon to 3. You need to write it in all three ways for this worksheet. And a 3 to 3 as a fraction. But if you look at this fraction, you'll notice 3 over 3 is not simplified. They can both be divided by 3. Okay? So we also would actually write, and the proper way to do this is to simplify these ratios. So that's also 1 to 1. So for every one triangle, there's a star. Okay? 1 to 1. And finally, as a fraction, it would be 1 over 1, but we leave it that way because it's a ratio. Like I said, you don't convert it to a whole number. Okay? That's number 3, or 2. Moving on, next one. This one says, what is the ratio of squares to triangles? So you got to count your squares. So if you did that, there's 11 of them. This is 11, and we're going to write it in all three ways. How many triangles we have, you need to count those. There's 15, so this is an 11 to 15, 11 to 15, and finally 11 to 15. And that 11/15 is already simplified, so you can leave it just like it is. Moving on, what is the ratio of pentagons to hearts? Well, count how many pentagons you have. You have 14 of them. Whew, 14, and we're going to compare it to hearts. So it's 14. How many hearts do we have? We have 3. 14 to 3. Write it in all three ways. And finally, the last way, 14 over 3. That's the answer to that one. And finally, this one. What is the ratio of pentagons to stars? Looks like we have 7 pentagons. And we're comparing that to our stars. We have 9, so it's a 7 to 9 relationship. 7 to 9, and finally as a fraction, 7 over 9. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the easy side. Make sure you write it in all three ways. Last one. This one's a little bit harder. You got to be very careful about the order. Okay, it says for every 9 cats, there are 7 dogs. But it wants to know what is the ratio of dogs to cats. So we need to put the dogs first. How many dogs do we have? Well, we have 7 dogs. So our ratio is going to be 7 to 9. 7 to 9 or 7 9. So you need to write it all three ways. At the thrift store, for every 6 short sleeve shirts, there were 3 long sleeve shirts. Whew. So this is 6 short, 3 long. Make sure we know that because we got to put them in order. It says, what is the ratio of long to short? So we need long to short. So we need to do the long ones first. So long is 3. To short is 6. So 3 to 6. 3 to 6 and 3 to 6. But most of you realize that 3 6 is not simplified. If I simplified it, it would be simplified to 1/2. So this is actually 1 to 2. 1 to 2, and 1 over 2, which means for every 1 long sleeve shirt, there are 2 short sleeve shirts out there. All right, last one. The ratio of males to females. So this means the 4 is first, so 4 males, 2 females. Right? And then it wants males here. Well, males was first on this side, so we need to keep that. So for every 4 males, there are 2 females. Be careful with those. Those try to trick you. They're confusing. They're not really, but if you try to rush, you won't get them right. The last one. At the malt shop, the ratio of hot dogs sold to hamburgers sold. So hot dogs to hamburgers was 8 to 3. For every blank hamburgers, hamburgers was second. For every blank hamburgers, so for every 3 hamburgers, there was 8 hot dogs sold. And that's how you should leave that. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 1 through 4 as examples there. Moving on. This is your exit ticket. I want you to write them in all 3 ways. That means using a colon, using the word to, and finally writing them in as fraction. We want to know what is the ratio of red flowers to all, what is the ratio of pink flowers to orange, and finally what is the ratio of all flowers to yellow flowers. What I do need you to do is make sure that they are simplified. Good luck. We're out.